Let's talk about combat. First, a quick summary in case you're just reviewing. We'll use the marauding orcs as an example. Each of the enemies and adventure sites that you would combat against has a card, and it shows that when it's revealed, what you do. So for the orcs, you reveal it face up. So when I reveal a tile that has the orc symbol, I place a token on it face up. In addition, the cards are very nice. They show you symbolically what happens. I can't move beside this without being engaged, and when I win, I get +1 reputation. So with the orcs, if I move from a space adjacent to a particular orc enemy and then move to a space that is also adjacent, I engage them. Now if I move from this one to that one, I would not provoke them because I have to be adjacent to the same enemy. So I can't move from one space adjacent to an enemy to another space adjacent. If I do that, then I will provoke the enemy and have to do combat. Each token has some basic symbols. Up the very top number is the armor. That's how much attack you must have to defeat them. On the left is their attack. That's how much they will attack you. On the bottom is the fame that you will earn if you beat the enemy. There are a number of special abilities that the enemies might have that are described on page 11 of the walkthrough and page 20, the very back of the rulebook. A fortified enemy has the castle keep next to the armor, and that means that you can only use siege weapons in the ranged and siege phase. So that means you cannot use ranged weapons. A swift attack, described here, means that you have to have twice the block of the attack in order to block it. Physical resistance means that you have to have twice the attack to beat them. So you would have to have 6 attack in order to beat this enemy. Brutal means that you will take twice the damage. This symbol means poison. If a unit is damaged with poison, that unit takes 2 wounds instead of 1. If the hero is damaged, he takes 1 wound into his hand and 1 wound into his discard pile for every damage. If a monster has this token that summons, what you do is during the block phase, when you are blocking, you will draw a brown token, and on the back of that monster will be the one that will attack for the block phase and for assigning damage. When that's done, this monster is discarded, and the rest is done by the original monster that did the summons. This symbol means paralyze. If a unit is wounded with paralyze, he is immediately discarded from the game. If a unit is paralyzed, then he must remove all of the non-wound cards from his hand. The essential details of combat are described in the walkthrough, pages 10 through 12. They're also described in the rulebook on page 7 and following. The phases of combat are ranged and siege attacks, the block phase, assigned damage phase, and then the attack phase. Okay, so let's go through some example combat that you might encounter when you first start Mage Knight. Our hero is against some of these marauding orcs, and here this is a prowler, and the different types of enemies that you can encounter are on the back of the walkthrough. This particular enemy has an armor of 3 and an attack of 4. You will gain 2 fame if you defeat this enemy. So here we have our hand, and you play the cards just like you would for movement or influence. Now, you do not need to, for those rampaging enemies, you do not need to move onto the space. You attack from adjacent to them. We look through our cards, and the first step of the combat is the range and siege phase. And so we look for any ranged attacks that we have. And this card here has a ranged attack 3. Now, 3 is enough to defeat the armor, which is 3 for this particular enemy. So by using a ranged attack, if we have white mana, then we can defeat that enemy. So if we defeat the enemy, we just take the token and discard it, and we increase our fame counter by 2. Suppose, on the other hand, the enemy we wanted to attack here was fortified. See the keep symbol next to the armor. And this is a digger. In this case, even though we have a ranged attack, we cannot use it because you can only use a siege card or siege attack against this kind of enemy. Now, locations such as the keep and the mage tower are already fortified. So all enemies within the keep or the mage tower are considered fortified. And if that enemy also has a fortified symbol on it, they're considered doubly fortified, and that means that you cannot attack it even with a sieged attack. So that means that you have to attack it only with a regular attack. Now let's consider ways that we could attack or combat this particular digger. We don't have in our hand any siege attack cards. This range attack card will not work. So we cannot really attack it in the range and siege attack phase. So we next move to the block phase, where the enemy is attacking us. Now all we would need to block this enemy has an attack of 3. All we would need is a block. We have a block 2 here. Now let's suppose in our source that we don't have any mana. We only have red and these are black. So we don't have any blue mana, so I can't block with 5. I could block with this with 2 and then add a third one to stop the attack. And then we could attack with the other cards. Let's assume, though, that I don't have the ability to block this particular enemy. Let's say that we only had 2 block. What would happen then? Then we would receive some damage. In the very beginning of the game, you only have an armor of 2 and you don't have any units. So if you did not block this enemy, they're attacking with a 3. And what you do is you assign wounds for each level above your armor. So for example, we're attacking with a 3 here. We've got an armor of 2, so we subtract 2 from that 3. And that means that we have a wound because the attack is greater than our armor. So we get 1 wound, and we put that in our deck. That leaves us with 1 more attack, and because they are attacking again, then we have to take another wound, even though our armor is greater than that 1. So we get another wound. So 1 minus 2 is less than 0, so now the enemy has finished their attack. Now the really bad thing about wounds is that wounds go into your hand. So just to show you here, we've got the hero card and the deed deck that we draw from and our discard pile, and this is our hand so that we're playing from. So when I get wounded, those wounds go into my hand. Now, which means I cannot discard this wound into the discard pile. I can't play it, if you will. So as I go in and I am playing these other cards, and they will go to the discard pile. So let's say that I've finished up my turn and I have 1 wound and 2 other cards. Well, when I draw next, my limit is 5, so I can only draw 2 more cards. Obviously, if I had more wounds, let's say I had 3 wounds in there, then I can only have 2 cards that I can actually play. So getting wounds for your hero is a kind of a tough thing. If an enemy has the poison, that's when one wound goes to your hand and 1 wound goes to the discard pile. Suppose we did have a unit, though. In this case, we've got some peasants, and the armor value is 3. So even though we did not block, when that enemy attacks, the damage would be done to the unit. And so they would take one wound card. Suppose your enemy had an armor value of 5. If the attack was unblocked, you can still assign damage to that unit. He will still take a wound card, even though his armor is greater than the attack, because the attack was unblocked. But he will receive the wound, and your hero will not. Let's look at a situation that's more difficult. So let's assume that we had a summons, and this monster is the one that we're fighting. The attack is 5, and this is brutal. This icon indicates it's brutal, so the damage is 2 times what the attack value is. So that's a total of 10. So if this enemy was unblocked, then they would do 10 points worth of damage. Now, you can block with only 5 points of block, but if you don't block, then the damage is twice. So here in this case, they're attacking. We didn't block, and so now we have to assign 10 points of damage. And let's assume that we have a peasant who has 3 armor. So that peasant, we first are going to assign damage to that peasant, and so we will wound that peasant. And from the 10, we will subtract his armor of 3, leaving 7. Now we can't assign another wound card to this peasant because he's already wounded. And we don't have any more units that we can assign damage to. So we are going to have to assign damage to the hero. So we've got 7 damage points that we need to account for. And what we do is we subtract the 2 from that, leaving 5, and we give 1 wound into our hand. Then we subtract 2 again, leaving us 3, and we have another wound card. So that's total of 2 wounds to our hero. So now we're dealing with 3 more points. Again, we subtract 2, and we have another wound card, so that's 3, leaving 1. We still have to assign for that. Subtract 2, that takes it below 0, but we have to add another wound. So that's 4 wounds to the hero. Now, for those of you who are mathematically inclined, you just take the amount of damage that you're going to assign, divide it by your armor, and round up. So 7 divided by 2 is 3.5, plus round up, so that's why we get 4 wounds. Now, if we notice, the number of cards that we can draw is 5. So if the number of wounds that you take is equal to or greater than that number, then you're knocked out. So we have 5. We took 4. If we had taken 5, we would be knocked out, which means that all of the cards in our hand that are not wound cards need to be discarded. Now, if you have skills, you can still play them, and you can still assign more wounds to your hero, but effectively all the cards that allow you to do things have been discarded for this turn. Okay, so let's return to our digger example. After the range and siege attack phase is the block phase, and after the block phase is the assigned damage phase. Now is the attack phase, so we can actually attack this enemy. Now, the enemy is fortified, which means that you could not use the ranged attack. You had to use the siege attack. But during the normal attack, this does not do anything to change the armor value. So all we need is 3 points of attack to defeat this enemy. And of course we can do that in any number of ways. If I have a card that has a block or attack of 2, I could play that and then play another card sideways if I wanted to. On the other hand, if I have a red mana, I could place red mana on the card, and this allows me to attack 4. So any number of ways that we could attack, just as a normal type of attack. And again, when we defeat the enemy, we get the 2 points of fame, plus 1 point of reputation for marauding orcs. Let's walk through one more example. Let's assume that the enemy that you're attacking has the summons. So you would first check to see for the ranged or siege attack. If you have a ranged or siege attack greater than 4, you can defeat the enemy immediately. But if you don't have that, during the block phase, a monster will be summoned. And so let's assume that we draw this particular monster. And so now this monster is attacking with the 7, but they have the swift icon, so that they are going to attack us with a total of 14. Wow, that's pretty bad. Now, if we can't block this, we won't have to assign 14 points of damage. We only assign 7 points of damage. But to see whether or not we block, that's what the swift is, and we have to be able to come up with 14 points of block. Now, suppose that I was able to come up with 10 points of block. That doesn't really help. We have to completely match the block. Then, after we decide block yes or block no, then we determine what the amount of damage to be dealt with is. It's not a subtraction like in some other games. So using that example, let's look at our hand here, and we've got a block of 5 if we had a blue mana. So let's assume that our source allows us to find a blue mana or a wild card if we're playing in the day, and so that's a block of 2. We have another card that gives us a block, block of 5. Have another card that allows us to have a block of 2, that's 7. And the rest we don't have any block, but we can turn them sideways, 8, 9, 10, 11. Even if I played all of those cards, I still am not able to block that 14 from this enemy with swift. So in that case, it doesn't do me any good to play any of these cards because I cannot block. So that's the essence of combat. One mini game that you could play to try to learn more about combat is just stack up some of these Marauding Orcs tokens and flip them over one at a time and go through your hand and see how many of the enemies that you can defeat. Can you defeat 5 of them with one hand? That's an interesting mini game to play. Give it a try.